I consider involuntary slavery a never-failing fountain of the grossest immorality, and one of the deepest sources of human misery. It hangs like the mantle of night over our republic, and shrouds its rising glories. I sincerely pity the man who tinges his hand in the unhallowed thing that is fraught with the tears and sweat and groans and blood of hapless millions of innocent, unoffending people.
The abolitionist movement really in its spirit goes back to the early times of enslavement, the 1600s, even before that, but it became more profound in the 1800s. It's a movement by individuals to stop slavery. It started with the states individually, and then it became a national movement.
But the actual abolitionist movement, given the name abolitionism as a political movement with, the tenet of immediate emancipation for all, starts in 1831 when William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator. The area of Cincinnati was very busy in that time period. It was really growing. And so we see abolitionist activity starting in the Cincinnati region in the 1830s, within just a few years of the movement really taking shape.
So Cincinnati had a troubled relationship with abolitionists. According to Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, she wrote after the Civil War, Great Men of Our Times. In the chapter on Salmon Peak Chase, she says that half of the loans made by Cincinnati banks used enslaved people as collateral. So there were people of all types of people who believed in abolition, people who believed that slavery was none of their business, people who didn't think it was bad, people who said the Bible condones it. And there were other people who said, okay, maybe slavery isn't such a good thing, but black people and white people will never be able to get along together, so we're going to condition ending slavery with sending people out of the country, either to Africa or to the Caribbean or someplace, any place. Colonization had a huge support, and it never worked very well. The numbers didn't work out. A country was founded in Africa called Liberia. The Colonization Society in Kentucky had its own Colonization Society. They didn't send, the whole time that society existed, a little over 600 people were sent there. Most of them got sick, many of them got sick and died. Because it would be like sending, I'm half Italian, right? It'd be like sending me back to Italy. Or what about, I'm part Irish too. Where would I go? I don't speak Italian very well. I'd be lost. So sending these people out of the country, most of them did not want to go.
How strange it is that anybody should believe any human being could be a slave and yet be contented. I do not believe there ever was a slave who did not long for liberty. I know very well that slave owners take a great deal of pains to make people in the free states believe that slaves are happy, but I know likewise that I was never acquainted with a slave, however well he was treated, who did not long to be free.
The Lane Theological Seminary was founded here in Cincinnati in 1829, and the first classes started in 1832. Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, was the first president of the Lane Theological Seminary, and it was located just 2 blocks from this house. In fact, this house was on the campus. It belonged to the seminary. The Lane Seminary was created so that there was a way to train Protestant ministers here in the West. Think of Cincinnati as being the West in the 1830s, and so there was a large influx of people that came to Cincinnati, but there were no Protestant seminaries west of the Allegheny Mountains. This was the first time that that was created, and that was a way to train ministers here who would stay here in this area and be able to minister to the people. This is also the time of the Second Great Awakening. There's a lot of religious fervor going on, and so it was important for the Lane Seminary. It was also founded by some abolitionists, so they had that connection already. Now, the Lane Seminary debates were because there were a couple of students who, were kind of agitators, and they said, hey, we want to do some debating about the topic of slavery, which was very important here in Cincinnati. So the students did these debates in the February of 1834. 18 days worth of debates, 2.5 hours each night, 9 on one topic, 9 on the other. One of the most eloquent speakers during the debates was the only African-American student at Lane Seminary. His name was James Bradley. He was giving personal testimony of his life as an enslaved person, and really swayed the students to the position of immediate emancipation. And therefore, because of those debates, the students really kind of took that on. They voted at the end and they said, we're all going to be abolitionists. Well, great, but the business people of Cincinnati don't want that happening here. And so the trustees tell the students to stop. Well, by this time, the students were out in the free black community. They were ministering, they were teaching school, they were, interacting with the free African-American population of Cincinnati. Well, the trustees really don't want that kind of controversy. They don't want that to come down on them. They tried to get them to stop. It doesn't work. They eventually set up their own school in Cumminsville and then moved to Oberlin College.
This abolitionist movement was really on the cusp of what does it mean to be anti-slavery? What kind of tactics do we take? How hard do we push? How much compromise do we make when compromise means sacrificing the rights of human beings? And that was taking place, that debate was happening here in Cincinnati really early on.
Cincinnati was all about commerce. They were there to make money, and the so-called Lane rebels who led these debates were chased out of town the following year because the commercial interest did not want to antagonize their customers in the South.
The Negro slaves of the South are the happiest, and in some sense, the freest people in the world. The children and the aged and infirm work not at all, and yet have all the comforts and necessities of life provided for them. They enjoy liberty because they are oppressed neither by care nor labor. The women do little hard work and are protected from the despotism of their husbands by their masters. The men and stout boys work, on the average, in good weather, not more than 9 hours a day. The balance of their time is spent in perfect abandon. Besides, they have their Sabbaths and holidays. White men, with so much of license and liberty, would die of ennui, but Negroes luxuriate in corporeal and mental repose. With their faces upturned to the sun, they can sleep at any hour, and quiet sleep is the greatest of human enjoyments. Blessed be the man who invented sleep.
The reason why Kentucky, northern Kentucky, and southern Ohio, the Cincinnati area and surrounding areas became a hotbed for abolitionist activity because it was a border state. And so it was right there. So the assumption was, and it was true, that because of Ohio's proximity to Kentucky, there's a lot of activity going on. In fact, like John Rankin moved to this area. John Rankin was a famous minister that was an abolitionist. He was a conductor of the Underground Railroad. He and his sons, they moved to this area to do this kind of work. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin, is from this area. In fact, there's her house is in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she spent quite a bit of time there. And all these individuals were a part of the abolitionist movement because of the region geographically.
So really, when you look at the Ohio River, it is the border between free state of Ohio and the slave state of Kentucky. So you have this huge economic and social disconnect between places that are right next door to each other. River towns play an important role in the economics of the day because river traffic is the transportation system. And because of those ideas, the proximity, the transportation, the social and economic impacts, that really creates a situation where people living on the border really have to know which side they're on.
Anytime you had enslaved people coming together and figuring out how to seek their own freedom, that's a part of the larger freedom movement. That's a part of even the early strands of the Underground Railroad. But even before that, even before it was called an Underground Railroad, and they begin to name things like abolitionists and so forth, the work was already started. People would often escape in groups and form their own maroon communities. When I say maroon communities, I mean communities of escaped enslaved people that formed their own towns, their own cities for years and years and years that were autonomous. All African Americans in the South were not enslaved people. There were pockets of free people, and many times those individuals were part of the freedom movement. People like Henry Boyd, who was an entrepreneur. He had been an enslaved man, black man. He moved to Cincinnati early on in 1824. He actually purchased his freedom. He was allowed to make money and purchase his freedom. Some say if we were using contemporary dollars, he purchased his freedom, it would be the equivalent of over $57,000. And so he worked odd jobs, and then ultimately he was, as a young person actually, at the age of 18, he became a carpenter's apprentice. And it turned out that Henry Boyd was gifted, very gifted at being a carpenter. And he moved to Ohio, but even though Ohio was a free state, there was still racism in Ohio, so he had a really hard time getting work. So through circumstances, one of the individuals at a certain company could not come to work. I think they called in sick or something like that. And Henry Boyd had an opportunity to show what he could do. And quickly he became very popular as a carpenter in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. And he became known for several patents, and he went on to have a very prominent business and be very, very successful. And he used his prominence to be a part of the Underground Railroad. He was thought to help hundreds of people.
Perhaps the mildest form of the system of slavery is to be seen in the state of Kentucky. Whoever visits some estates there and witnesses the good-humored indulgence of some masters and mistresses and the affectionate loyalty of some slaves might be tempted to dream of the oft-fabled poetic legend of a patriarchal institution. But over and above the scene there broods a portentous shadow, the shadow of law. So long as the law considers all these human beings with beating hearts and living affections only as so many things belonging to a master, so long as the failure or misfortune or imprudence or death of the kindest owner may cause them any day to exchange a life of kind protection and indulgence for one of hopeless misery and toil, so long it is impossible to make anything beautiful or desirable in the best regulated administration of slavery.
So Harriet had become a published writer as early as 1833. Her first book was a geography book for students because she had been a teacher. She also started writing short stories and essays. But one of her first, what I would call her first political piece of writing, took place in 1836. There had been a newspaper guy named James Birney. He actually founded a newspaper in New Richmond, and then it moved here to Cincinnati. And that newspaper was an abolitionist newspaper called The Philanthropist. Well, the business community of Cincinnati didn't like what he was doing. So what did they do? They broke into his office, tore up the printing press, marched it down Main Street, and threw it in the Ohio River. Then they set about attacking the people living in that neighborhood, which of course was the free black community here of Cincinnati. So now you have mob violence and racial violence in the streets of Cincinnati. During the James Burney incident, Harriet is living here at her father's house because she is newly pregnant. Her husband has gone on a business trip to Europe, and so she's staying here at the house. She wishes she could go down and help the people that are being attacked by mob violence, but she realizes that's probably not a good idea. So she writes instead. She writes the letter to the editor of another newspaper here in town, and it's set up like a short story. Two guys talking at the dinner table about the James Burney incident and about the printing press. And the thesis of her story is that freedom of speech and freedom of the press are important for democracy. And if you don't agree with someone, that's no reason to beat them up in the street. And when you start that kind of violence, it will probably backfire on you. So that really was an important incident for Harriet in shaping her ideals. You know, she had learned a lot about abolition from the debates and the aftermath of the debates, but then she really honed her skills in terms of defending the ideas of what do we do to help people who are not being treated justly or fairly.
You know, it brings new depth to Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was here in this area observing. She had seen it, she felt it, she knew it. She embellished some of the stories, but they were all based on actual events. The crossing of the river by Eliza, that's a true story. If you put all the pieces together, the detail of the roads, the detail of what's now US Route 68, the detail of Eliza's escape, it matches perfectly. There's even a stone tavern that fits the description of one of the early chapters of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it sits south of Flemingsburg on US Route 68, south of Maysville. So she was just taking this in and presenting it in a way that humanized, that put personalities into this, and it showed the impact that women could have. What can women do? Well, they can influence public opinion. She writes in the book about the senator's wife, the senator's wife convinces the senator, the Ohio senator, to become an abolitionist, to take a part in Eliza's escape. These were, women held the power, and were just figuring out how to grab it. There's another woman in Cincinnati, Sarah Otis Ernst. She organized these sewing festivals, these sewing exhibitions. They were sewing clothes for runaways, is what they were doing. But they had speakers, they had these were big things in the late 1840s, early 1850s. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary, in September of 1862, he wrote that, but set January 1st as the day. He offered an end to the war, an end to the Civil War, if the South would agree to certain terms and that slavery could continue, if they would lay down their arms, continue for a while. Harriet herself went to the White House to speak with President Lincoln. But Harriet's firsthand experience, her close-up view, her witnessing of a young child being sold away from a screaming, tearful mother, that happened 20 miles from here.
The law will never make a man free. It is men who have got to make the law free.
So another prominent member of the anti-slavery community in our area that I think everyone should know about is William S. Bailey. He ran an anti-slavery paper out of Newport, Kentucky in the 1840s and 1850s. There's this really cool ad that he placed in the Williams Directory. The Williams Directory was like our local yellow pages of the 19th century. And in it, he took out a full-page ad for an anti-slavery paper in an area where it was deeply unpopular to be anti-slavery. And he was like, come at me, you know, he put it out there. Unfortunately, he gave away his location, right? He gave away his address, and mobs showed up and threw his press into the river. Unfortunately, they kept attacking him. They would set things on fire. My favorite story is actually about his daughter. So a mob had showed up at the office that he was running with his family. His daughter was upstairs. She had been painting earlier in the day, and one of the mob members came in and was being a ruffian, and so she dumped yellow paint on him. And he shook his hand at her and he said, "You're lucky you're not a man." And she says, "You're lucky I'm not a man." And I think that's pretty cool. A lot of people in the anti-slavery community, especially abolitionists, were academics, and they had these kind of high-minded ideas about why slavery was wrong, essentially tied to religion. William S. Bailey tied it to economics and the fact that this is bad for people in the United States economically, as well as just being a horrendous thing to be doing to people.
Well, I can name two who are on the abolitionist all-star team who were in and out of this building, one of whom probably lived here, another one would have visited. John Gregg Fee, the founder of Berea College, a famous abolitionist, was from Bracken County. He grew up in a family of enslaved, where he was taken care of by enslaved people. He grew to hate slavery. He grew to hate the slave power. His father was a slaveholder. Went to college here, then goes to Miami University and studies, then to the Lane Seminary, where Herod Beecher Stowe's father, Lyman Beecher, was the president. One day he fell to his knees and said, "Oh Lord, if needs be, make me an abolitionist." Because he knew that proclaiming that label to be yours, if you were an abolitionist, you were cutting yourself off from family, from friends. Abolitionists were in a minority. They were well known, but they were considered to be troublemakers and heretics in some cases. When a formerly enslaved person who was owned by John Fee's father, John Gregg Fee's father, moved to Felicity, brought her children who were born after she was free to Felicity, and her husband. They lived there, but she wasn't able to bring all of her children because they were still owned by other people. And so when she heard that that those people, her children and grandchildren, were going to be sold down to New Orleans, that she would probably never see them again if that were to happen, she forged a plan. This woman's name was Juliet Miles. She got in a boat, rowed across the river near Utopia, Ohio, and landed near that stone house about 4 miles west of Augusta. She spent the night going from here up to Brooksville and to Germantown, gathering up her children and grandchildren. It took longer than she thought. By the time she got back to the shore where her boat was to get across the river to freedom, the sun had come up and slave catchers were after her. They found her. She was thrown in jail. She was dragged into jail. It was Matilda Fee who then came to her rescue and almost got her off. Almost got her off. She was charged with enticing. She was about to be released on bond on those charges in Bracken County when a deputy from Mason County came into the courtroom and says, "But wait, some of these people she enticed were from Mason County, and Mason County is not going to let her off." She was thrown back in jail, eventually convicted, and spent about 3 years in the state penitentiary in Frankfort, where she died, it was said, of a broken heart. Matilda Fee and John Gregg Fee visited her in the state penitentiary. They kept working to get her free. They weren't just, passive bystanders. They were active in it. It took courage, it took guts to do that. The second abolitionist of note from not only Northern Kentucky, but from here in Augusta, and his house is just right 2 blocks away from here, the biggest house in Augusta, was James Thome, Thome. His father was the richest man in town. His father owned 15, 16 enslaved people. James was one of the leaders of the Lane debates. James went to school here and then goes to Cincinnati and becomes caught up in 1834. Hard to believe, 190 years ago, here's this young man who grew up in a slave household going to Cincinnati and arguing about the evils of slavery. His father tried to prevent him from going to New York to attend a meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He addressed this big conference. His speech was called The Southern Slave Kitchen, Sodom of the Nation. This is what he called his talk. He crushed the notion that slavery had anything good about it, because he grew up with it. He saw the effect that it had on both the enslaved and the enslavers. Within a few years, he had convinced his father to free his slaves. It was such a notable event. It was New Year's Day, 1836, when his father called his workers in and said, "You are now free." It was picked up in newspapers around the country as far away as Vermont. At the end of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that shows up almost word for word. What happened here in Augusta is in one of the final chapters of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Word for word, from both the slaveholder and the newly freed people.
One couple that I have to talk about would be Peter and Sarah Fawcett. Peter was freed in 1850 and he came to Cincinnati, in part because I'm sure Cincinnati was kind of a growing area, especially for free black people at the time. And so Peter comes to Cincinnati 1850. In 1854, he marries an absolute firecracker of a woman named Sarah Fawcett. Together, they were active in the Underground Railroad. Sarah Fawcett was actually like a 19th century Rosa Parks. She was a hairdresser. She was very good at it. She'd been trained in New Orleans, and she was on her way to see a bride who needed her hair done, and she decided to try to board the passenger car. So she paid her fare, boards the car, and the conductor tries to get her back off the car. The car goes into motion and they are still fighting it out. At one point, the conductor is trying to push Sarah off the car. She is holding on with both hands and biting his knuckles to try to get him to let go of her. Ultimately, she has to let go and she falls off, and she was injured, and so she sued the passenger car company. And they were forced to pay her fare back. As a result of her case, black women and children were required to be allowed to ride the passenger car, and black men were allowed to ride on the platform. Peter and Sarah were very popular entrepreneurs in their different fields. Peter was a chef and a caterer. His mother, Edith Hearn, had actually been a chef for Thomas Jefferson at the White House, so he came by it naturally. He had a wildly popular catering company. Sarah was very popular with her hair and her scalp treatments, that sort of thing. And they still have descendants living in Cincinnati today. They helped establish the First Baptist Church of Cumminsville. That congregation is still here. They have a wide-reaching legacy here in Cincinnati.
When you think about the freedom movement and when we think about abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, it's much more complex. And even the history of enslavement in this country and how we think about enslavement is much more complex. When you take a place like Kentucky, some people were pro-slavery, some people were anti-slavery, some people were in the middle. Some African Americans were pro-slavery, and some were in the middle, and some were completely against it because of the complexity of politics, the complexity of social connections. Some enslaved people had masters, enslavers, I should say, that they considered benevolent and nice, and they were okay with the system. For example, there was a minister that had such autonomy And I'm certainly not advocating that slavery was a good thing, but he had such autonomy, he could have escaped many times over. But because of the freedom he had to make money and to help, he even helped people be free. He even helped purchase other people's freedom. But he had so much autonomy that he died an enslaved person. And when he passed away, he remained enslaved. I use that example to show the complexity of this time period. You also had free blacks. Husbands would purchase their wives. They would make enough money, and so you had a situation where the husband was a legal slave and the wife was free. You had also the complexity of sometimes enslavers, when they die in their will, they would say, we hereby free our 40 slaves. And so in Augusta, Kentucky, in the region of Bracken County, you had free people, you had enslaved people, which made it a lot more complicated than we realized. And those people had different allegiances. They would help with the freedom movement, they would help on the Underground Railroad. Sometimes it wasn't like the sort of Harriet Tubman or the sort of preacher on horseback, the circuit riders that was going from town to town helping people free. Sometimes it was simply when they come to a place like Augusta, they can stop and get a meal at my house. Or when they go to Ripley, go this way. And so people had different degrees of assisting people. So it wasn't as black and white. History is never black and white anyway. There's all these complexities about how things unfold.
Love thy neighbor as thyself rang in my ears. I also considered the condition of the slave owner. I knew he was willingly deceived by the false teachings of the popular ministry. I knew also that the great part of the non-slave owners, who were by their votes and action the actual slave holders, did not see their crime. I knew also that the great body of the people were practically without the fundamental principle of the gospel, love to God and love to man. So now the great doctrine of loving God supremely and our neighbor as ourselves, on which hang all the law and the prophets, though clearly written in the Bible, was not seen in its practical application by the great mass of the people.
There were black people here who lived in Augusta who were free, who were part of the community. Sarah Thomas was one of them. She had the support and cooperation of many white people. Sarah Thomas, the woman who started the church that's now being restored. She was enslaved, and as far as we know, into the early 1830s. She became free, perhaps through the intervention of the person who was in charge of this college, Augusta College. Then she became rich. By the time she died in 1839, she had a home a few blocks from here. She had horses, she had a carriage, she had furniture, she had chairs, she had a shotgun. We know all this because these were the items that were categorized in her will. And when she passed away, she willed that everything that she owned be sold. Not only the property, her house, her land, but also 3 notes that people owed to her. She was a banker. She loaned money, but in the 1830s, the banks in the United States failed. She had money to lend, and she did. Those notes were all collected. The property cataloged, gathered, and sold and auctioned off by her executors who were white. But she directed them to use the proceeds to purchase the freedom of her husband. She died, he became free within months. The money didn't change hands for 3.5 years. So think about the level of trust.
Sarah Thomas was born into slavery in the 1790s, we believe. She was deeded land by a man named Martin Reuter. Martin Reuter deeded land to Sarah Thomas in the 1830s. She was deeded Lot 24. At the time, we don't know that she was actually even free yet. It was deeded as well to her husband, Harry Thomas. We know for a fact that Harry Thomas was still enslaved at the time. And that's some of the early evidence we get of something that really interesting that happened in Augusta, that happened a lot in these border towns. The Ohio River didn't used to be nearly as deep as it is now. It wasn't as wide. You could look across the river and see people living in a wildly different society. You could look across the river from Kentucky into a free state. And that really affected the way that people thought about slavery. They were really grappling with it on a day-to-day basis. You'll see in a lot of Kentucky families people who have very different ideas, even within the same generation. So Martin Reuter was deeding land to people, one of whom was enslaved, one of whom may have still been enslaved. So he was making legal a transaction that federally was not really legal, was not really recognized. You couldn't deed property to an enslaved person, it belonged to their enslaver. Throughout the history of Augusta, you see people like Sarah Thomas, people like Peter and Charles Underwood, people like Henry Henderson, another person involved with the church. They would acquire property and then they would share that with their community. So it was very much about building one another up. They were also acquiring property and doing a lot of business with white landowners in the city as well. I think that Augusta had to grapple in a unique way with what it meant to be unfree in a society supposedly founded on the principle of liberty and freedom. And I think that they hashed out a unique way to deal with that. And that included things like, making legal a transaction between Martin Reuter and Sarah and Harry Thomas, one of whom at least is enslaved. So I think that Augusta shows us something really interesting in that people had to cooperate in a way that was really unique.
Augusta historically was a town that was always connected with the abolitionist movement. And we should also talk about Augusta College and also Echo Hall, which was the dorm that's still standing today in Augusta, Kentucky.
Yes, Augusta College was very prominent in the world of abolitionists. The college debated. I'm not sure it was in this room. It was probably in the college itself. But they held debates on abolition, on slavery here in this college. And the results were recorded. And almost every debate that was held here, the students came out in favor of abolition. Now this made people in Ohio nervous. They didn't want to send their young students, their children here because they didn't want them getting swept up in this. And it certainly made people in the South unwilling to send their students here because they might come into contact with these fire-breathing abolitionists. So financial troubles soon grew. The president of the college, who lived in that yellow house around the corner, Dr. Joseph Tomlinson, was an abolitionist, was firmly against slavery. And when the Methodist Church split apart, he was an ordained Methodist minister as well. He took to task his departed members of the Methodist Episcopal South Church. He condemned their slaveholding. His speech was printed by William Lloyd Garrison in The Liberator in January of 1849. The next month, the state of Kentucky revoked the charter of the college. That was it. Now, the building stood. Another school moved in, but Augusta College as an entity ended in 1849 when the charter was revoked. Interestingly, between 1849 and 1850, the population of Augusta dropped by 25% the year after the college closed. So imagine the economic impact. Ripley didn't suffer that kind of outflow, neither did Maysville. It was all in Augusta. It was confined to Augusta, which lost 25% of its population. So Augusta College wasn't huge, but in our sense of the word, but it was well known and well attended in its heyday, and it attracted students from all around the country. People who became U.S. senators studied here. People who became confidants to generals here. William Groesbeck is in Groesbeck, Cincinnati, came to school here. So it had a good reputation. It was a liberal arts college, even though it was affiliated with the Methodist Church. There was no requirement that people be Methodist or that they train for the clergy to become a clergy person here. But many did. But frequently people would come to school here it was more like a preparatory school in that way. They would graduate at 16 and 17 years old, but they learned science. They studied biology and archaeology and physical science and logic and classical languages and math and science. It was a liberal arts college, and then went somewhere else. Many of them went to Yale. This was a school where people came to learn and go on to great things. When Lincoln wrote a letter early in the Civil War saying that we must hold Kentucky. Without Kentucky, we are lost. If we lose Kentucky, we'll lose Missouri, we'll lose Maryland, and we may as well evacuate the capital. That letter was written to Senator Orville Browning, who graduated from right here. So these people went on to big things in law and in the arts, science, medicine. They learned quite a bit here. But it was the concern after the college in the 1840s, there was an exodus. There was a little rebellion here where some of the anti-abolitionist movement decided they'd had enough, and they left. And they were led by one of the professors who was recruited away to Transylvania University. So that hurt. So they started losing support. The Kentucky Conference of the Methodist Church cut support. So did the Ohio Conference. Suddenly, they didn't have support from any organized body. They started running out of money. The growth of the student body slowed down and began to dwindle. And that was it. And then the final blow again was in February 1849 when the charter was revoked.
Slavery can only be abolished by raising the character of the people who compose the nation, and that can be done only by showing them a higher one.
We have to be able to read the past to understand why things are the way they are today. And I know a lot of people in the United States in general would love to think that we are past the idea of, racial bias and so forth. But we have had so many centuries of, centuries of slavery and then centuries of work to try to overcome that. And, even looking at, between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement was a whole 100 years. And so by understanding why we are where we got today, we have to know that it's not a journey that's over. We are living in a border city. Cincinnati has often been called the northernmost southern city or the southernmost northern city. During Jim Crow days, people would be taking a train south, and when they got to Cincinnati, African Americans would have to get off the car and move to a different train car before they crossed the river into Kentucky. And that was happening in the 20th century. So the dialogue that we need to have is just making sure that we are talking about racial healing overall.
In our society, we sanitize history, but there is a philosophy that we have, the philosophy of American exceptionalism, that we have to only show the good stories. Like the founding fathers did nothing wrong, the patriots did nothing wrong. And that's really a sanitized version of history. We have to begin to dig deep and say, okay, George Washington was a great guy, but there's some other things we need to learn about. He owned slaves. So I think people think when we go deeper, we're being negative. We're taking away from the gods that we've put on the pedestal, so to speak. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. But we need a deeper philosophy with history, and we talked about this in some of my graduate classes, is to look at the real, look at Abraham Lincoln as a human. He struggled with the question of slavery because of politics. He struggled with whether he wanted to pass the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. He was thinking about how would that affect him as a political person, his political career. It's okay to have that conversation. It doesn't take from what he did. And so we need to take a deeper dive in history, and people are afraid to do that. People need to learn to slow down and talk to each other as opposed to at each other. as opposed to having social media wars. We need to have civil conversations. So the dialogue that needs to happen is to listen really on both sides, but both sides has to be ready to come and have an honest conversation and to listen. That's what democracy is, a democratic republic. It's all about unity. We're not going to always agree, but we should be able to agree to have conversations about making this a better place and moving away from the ugly times of enslavement and the ugly times of Jim Crow. And what is our future going to look like? And we all want a brighter future. I think we can all agree on that.
There's this misconception that slavery ended in 1865 and that was it. And that's not the case at all. If you read things like Slavery by Another Name, it's an excellent book that discusses the fact that, in fact, the criminal justice system was kind of just remolded to re-enslave people. There were a lot of different actions taken to try to reverse the end of slavery as much as it was possible to do, right? And I mean, even when you look at the 13th Amendment forbids slavery except as punishment for a crime of which you've been duly convicted. That's highly open to interpretation, and it allowed for people to be re-enslaved inside the criminal justice system. You also see vestiges of slavery in the education system. You see vestiges of slavery in politics. You see things like in the 20th century, there's redlining, there's blockbusting. There has been a concerted effort since the end of slavery to try to continue a legacy of white supremacy. And I understand that it is absolutely the case that we should celebrate the 13th Amendment and the end of legal slavery. That is absolutely the case. But we have to also be mindful of the reality that it's not completely over, and it's had a huge shaping of our society, and we're still seeing those effects today. I think that there are also a lot of misconceptions out there about why we fought the Civil War in the first place. I believe that we should let history speak for itself. When you look at secessionist documents written at the time of the Civil War, what you see pretty clearly is that, yes, they were concerned about states' rights, but they were concerned about states' rights to maintain the institutions of slavery and white supremacy. The Civil War was fought in many ways over the question of the expansion of slavery or the end of slavery. That is not a matter of opinion. That is documented fact. And I think that historians have a responsibility to talk about what evidence is, how we know what we know, and what kind of conclusions we can actually draw from the history as it is.
Yes, history is having a conversation with the present. History is informing us today. There's a connection between the freedom movements of days gone by and the freedom movements now. Enslavement still happens. There's not only sex trafficking in this state, in this country, but there's also traditional enslavement around the world. And so the call of freedom is still there today. I think part of the challenge is folks think that we're further along than we really are. There's a mindset that we're post-racial still, especially after the Obama years. People said sort of, see, we have a black president, now everybody can chill out and relax because we've made progress. But it seems after the Obama presidency, a lot of people's true sentiments really came out. You saw the rise of hate groups. You saw church shootings. You saw people going into traditional black churches and killing people because of the color of their skin while they were praying. And so we found out we weren't as far along as we thought. And so the call for freedom is still today, still goes on today. It's still much needed. Sometimes historians talk about when did the civil rights movement start. Some people push the civil rights movement back during the time of enslavement. They connected to the Underground Railroad. And so if we're thinking about that, the abolitionist movement, Underground Railroad. So if we're thinking about that trajectory, the abolitionist movement folded into the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement continued on today with Black Lives Matter, with helping folks across the border, understanding the role, the travail of undocumented folks, the DACA individuals, and trying to advocate for those individuals and trying to have sensible conversations about children at the border and not putting them in cages in prisons. So there's still a freedom movement that's going on today. We need to harken back that there's so much we can learn, like that prophetic voice that Cornel West talked about, the prophetic pragmatism. We can learn, we can look to the past to speak to the here and now, to think about and talk about the future.
You know, I'm a product of the Kentucky education system, and I had some really great history teachers, but there was a little bit of a tendency to portray morality as something that was inevitable. Like, of course slavery ended. Of course the Civil Rights Act was enacted. And the fact is that, no, not of course. Bad things happened throughout history. Terrible things happened to good people. And people who were very courageous stood up, put themselves in harm's way, and fought. And even in the face of that, there were people who are prepared to take those gains away from us. Morality and goodness only happen when we defend them.
So I think that early thread from Augusta College extends all the way into today. The valuing education and valuing discussion. You know, that's if they take anything away from this place, it's that we don't know everything that happened yet, but there's no harm in trying to find out what happened. It's still possible to learn what these people thought, what they were like. There are letters in attics, in trunks inside homes that had not seen the light of day for 100 years. But these are what people thought. These are what people did. And through that, we can see how they lived and what they thought, and how that influenced the people we've become today. But I believe that these stories and these people and these facts that we've gathered have the power to help people see things in a way they hadn't seen them before, and to cause people to change their mind, perhaps. You had people who were adamant slaveholders renounce slavery. So people can change, but the change has to happen, has to start somewhere between your head and your heart. It has to start somewhere. It can't happen because someone's beating you over the head with facts or beating you over the head with how you should feel. It probably won't work that way. And so, you know, if discussions can be had where people can examine the facts put before them in a non-threatening, non-emotional way, even though these are very emotional topics. But when you hold them up to the light of reason, what do they look like? What do they do? And how can they affect your thinking? It may not be an instant, it may not be immediate, but at some point, when you put all these threads together and you see the bigger pattern, the light goes off, and you can say, oh, wow, I didn't realize all these things fit together like that. But they do.
In that great getting up morning, fare ye well, fare ye well. In that great getting up morning, fare ye well, fare ye well. Preacher, fold your Bible, fare ye well, fare ye well. Oh, preacher, fold your Bible, fare ye well, fare ye well. Blow your trumpet, Gabriel, fare ye well, fare ye well. Oh, blow your trumpet, Gabriel. Fare ye well, fare ye well. Lord, how loud shall I blow it? Fare ye well, fare ye well. Lord, how loud shall I blow it? Fare ye well, fare ye well. Blow it right, calm and easy. Fare ye well, fare ye well. Blow it right, calm and easy. Fare ye well, fare ye well. My Lord, he calls me by the lightning. The trumpet sounds within my soul. Ain't got long to stay here. My Lord, he calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. Ain't got long to stay here. Ain't got long to stay here. Ain't got long to stay here.